Welcome to ePathshala's lecture series on computer science. The subject is graphics and visualization, and in today's module we are going to look at perception and colors. The learning objectives of today's module are: this helps you to introduce the approaches to visual perception. This module helps us to learn the visual perception theories. This module will also help us to learn about the various color principles, color space and the color differences, and this module also helps us to know about the good and bad usage of colors. So what is visual perception? Visual perception is the ability to interpret the surrounding environment by processing the information that is contained in the visible light. The resulting perception is also called as eyesight, sight, or the other name is given as vision. Various psychological components involved in vision are collectively referred to as the visual system. And the focus of this particular visual system has much of importance and research in the psychology, in subjects like psychology, cognitive science, neuroscience, and in molecular biology. What is this visual perception? Let us take an example and know what this visual perception is all about. The major problem in visual perception is that what people see is not simply a translation of their retinal stimuli. The people interested in perception has long struggled to explain what the visual processing does to create what is being actually seen. So let us look at this picture that is shown here. If you look at this picture for a few seconds and let us look into the visual inspection of what happens when we look at that particular picture. While the background is out of focus for this picture, which represents a peripheral vision, the first eye movement in that picture goes to the boots of that particular person. And the second, third and fourth eye movements jumps from face to face of each person that are represented in this particular picture. Then we might even permit or we might even compare between the various faces that we see on that particular picture. It may be concluded that the icon face is a very attractive search icon within the peripheral field of vision. The foveal vision adds detailed information to the peripheral vision or to the first eye movement. It can also be noted there are three different types of eye movements, which are called as the vergence movement, saccadic movements and the pursuit movements. Let us see what these three movements are. The vergence movements involve the cooperation of both the eyes to allow for an image to fall on the same area of both the retinas. The result of this vergence movement is a focused image. Next is the saccadic movement. The saccadic movement is a type of eye movement that makes jumps from one position to another position, and it is used to rapidly scan a particular scene or an image. Lastly, we have the pursuit movement, which is a smooth eye movement and is used to follow the objects that are in motion in the given picture. See, if we look at the face and object recognition, these two recognitions are actually accomplished by two distinct systems. For example, the prosopaganistic patients show deficits in face but not in object processing, while the object agnostic patients show deficit in object recognition with spared face processing. Faces are also subject to inversion effects, leading to the claim that face recognition is very special basically. Face and object processing have distinct neural system to recognize the face and the object. If we look at the cognitive and the computational approaches to perception, the Gestalt perception laws are usually very descriptive and they are not explanatory as such. One cannot also explain how humans see continuous contours by simply stating that the brain prefers good continuity, by simply stating that the brain prefers good continuity. The computational models of vision had more success in explaining the visual phenomena and have largely superseded the Gestalt theory. Computational models of visual perception have been developed for visual reality systems. These are closer to real life situation as they account for motion and activities which are prevalent in the real world field. The psychological theory of gestaltists have descriptive principles but without a model for perceptual processing as such. Some of the Gestalt laws of perceptual organization are very vague and inadequate as such. In the 1970s, David Marr had developed a multi-level theory of vision which analyzed the process of vision at different levels of abstraction. He has identified 3 levels of analysis in vision processing, namely the computational, algorithmic and at the implementation level. So the computational level of vision processing addresses at a high level of abstraction the problem that the visual system must overcome. The algorithmic level of vision processing attempts to identify the strategy that may be used to solve the above problems. The implementation level attempts to explain how solutions to these problems are realized in the neural capacity as such. Marr also suggested that it is possible to investigate vision at any one of these 3 levels independently. Marr described vision as proceeding from a 2-dimensional visual array to a 3-dimensional description of the world as output. Marr's stages of vision include a 2D or primal sketch of the scene which is based on the feature extraction of fundamental components of the scene such as the edges, regions, etc. Then a 2.5 dimension sketch of the scene where textures are also acknowledged, and a 3-dimensional model of the scene where the scene is visualized in a continuous 3-dimensional map. These are the various stages of vision given by Marr. There is a process called transduction, which is a process through which the energy from environmental stimuli is converted to neural activity for the brain to understand and process the information. The back of the eye contains 3 different types of cell layers, namely the photoreceptor layer, the bipolar cell layer and the ganglion cell layer. The photoreceptor layer is at the very back and contains the rod photoreceptors and the cone photoreceptors. Cones are responsible for color perception, and there are 3 different types of cones, namely red, green and blue types of cones. Photoreceptors also contain within them a special chemical called as a photopigment. They are embedded in the membrane of the brain called as a lamella. A single human rod contains approximately 10 millions of these photoreceptor cells. There are 3 specific photopigments that respond to specific wavelengths of light. When the appropriate wavelength of light hits the photoreceptors, its photopigment splits into 2, which sends a message to the bipolar cell layer, which in turn sends a message to the ganglion cells, and which then sends the information through the optic nerve to the brain. If the appropriate photopigment is not in the proper photoreceptor, then a condition which is called as color vision deficiency will occur. The opposite process of this transduction is an operant process, where in the transduction process, the chemical messages are sent from the photoreceptors to the bipolar cells and to the ganglion cell, whereas in the operant process, the reverse occurs. Several photoreceptors may send the information to one ganglion cell. There are 2 types of ganglion cells, namely the red-green and the yellow-blue ganglion cell. The brain interprets different colors when the rate of firing of these neurons alerts. The red light simulates the red cone, which in turn simulates the red-green ganglion cell. Likewise, the green light simulates the green cone, which stimulates the red-green ganglion cell. And similarly for the blue light, which simulates a blue cone, and this in turn simulates the yellow-blue ganglion cell. There are various theories and observations of visual perception, and that has been the main source of inspiration for computer vision as such. It is also called as a machine vision or computational vision. Special hardware structures and software algorithms provide the machines with the capability to interpret the images coming from a camera or a sensor. Artificial visual perception has long been used in the industry and is now entering the domains of automotive and robotics. The visual perception theory. Sense organs receive the information from the environment. Each sense organ is part of the sensory system, which receives sensory inputs and transmits sensory information to the brain. A particular problem for psychologists is to explain the process by which the physical energy received by these sense organs forms the basis of the perceptual experience. Sensory inputs are somehow converted into perceptions of desks and computers, flowers and buildings, cars and planes into sights, sounds, smells, tastes and touch experiences. A major theoretical issue on which the psychologists are divided is the extent to which the perception relies directly on the information present in the stimulus. Perceptual processes are not always direct. It depends on the perceiver's expectation and the previous knowledge as well as the information that is available in the stimulus as such. Psychologists distinguish between two types of processes in perception, namely the bottom-up processing and the top-down processing. Let us have a look at both these processing approaches in detail. The bottom-up processing, it is also known as the data-driven processing. Perception begins with the stimulus itself. Processing is carried out in one direction from the retina to the visual cortex, with each successive stage in the visual pathway carrying out ever more complex analysis of the input. This is a bottom-up processing approach. The next one is a top-down processing approach, which refers to the use of contextual information in pattern recognition. For example, understanding difficult handwriting is easier when reading complete sentences rather than reading single and isolated words. This is because the meaning of the surrounding words provide a context to aid the understanding. So psychologist Richard Gregory in the year 1970s argued that perception is a constructive process which relies on top-down processing approach. For Gregory, perception is a hypothesis. For Gregory, perception involves making inferences about what we see and trying to make a best guess. Prior knowledge and past experiences, he added, are crucial in perception basically. Sometimes looking at something, we develop a perceptual hypothesis which is actually based on the prior knowledge. The hypotheses we develop are nearly always correct, and on rare occasion it may be misleading also. A lot of information reaches the eye, but much is being lost by the time it reaches the brain. The brain has to guess what a person sees based on only the past experiences, he says. We actively construct our perception of reality. Richard Gregory proposed that perception involves a lot of hypothesis testing to make sense of the information presented to the sense organs. Our perceptions of the world are hypothesis based on past experiences and stored information. Sensory receptors receive the information from the environment, then combined with previously stored information about the world, it is possible for us to perceive the information what we see. It has been built up as a result of experience, he says. The formation of incorrect hypotheses will lead to errors in perception. There are various evidences to support Gregory's theory. Highly unlikely objects tend to be mistaken for likely objects. Then perceptions can also be ambiguous. Perception allows behavior to be generally appropriate to nonsensed object characteristics. Let us look at all these evidences in detail. Perceptions can be ambiguous. This is a good example. This is a Necker tube that has been shown in the image. When you stare at the crosses on the cube, the orientation can suddenly change or flip. It becomes unstable, and a single physical pattern can produce two different perceptions as such. Gregory argued that this object appears to flip between orientation because the brain develops two equally plausible hypotheses and is unable to decide between them. Some of the critical evaluation of Gregory's theories are the nature of perceptual hypothesis, the perceptual development process, and the sensory evidence process. So let us first look at the nature of perceptual hypothesis theory. Scientists modify a hypothesis according to the support they find, for it is so we as perceivers also able to modify our hypothesis. In some cases, it would seem that the answer is yes. Look at the figure above. This is a figure that has been shown on the screen. This actually looks like some random arrangement of black shapes. Actually, there is in fact a hidden face that is seen in this figure. Are you able to identify that hidden face that is seen in that particular figure? The face is actually looking straight ahead and is in the top half of the picture, that is in the center. The figure is strongly lit from the side and has a long hair and a beard. So this is a face. Once the face is discovered, very rapid perceptual learning takes place, and the ambiguous picture now obviously contains a face each time we look at it. We have learned to perceive the stimulus in a different way. For example, illusions persist even when we have the full knowledge of them. One would expect that the knowledge we have learned would modify our hypothesis in an adaptive manner. The current hypothesis testing theories cannot explain this lack of relationship between the learning and the perception. Next is the perceptual development process. A perplexing question for the constructionist is who proposed perception is essentially top-down in nature, and then how can the neonat or the newborn ever perceive? If we all have to construct our real world based on the past experiences, why then are our perceptions so similar even across cultures? Relying on individual constructs for making sense of the world makes perception a very individual and chancy process. The constructivist approach stresses the role of knowledge in perception. Sensory evidence. The major criticism of the constructivists is that they have underestimated the richness of sensory evidence available to perceivers in real world. We correctly perceive the size of the object even though the retinal image of the object shrinks as the object recedes from us. They propose that sensory evidence from other sources must be available for us to be able to do this. There is a rich array of sensory information including other objects, background, the distance, horizon and the movement. This rich source of sensory information is important to the second approach to explain perception as such. The second approach is a bottom-up approach given by Gibson. Gibson in the year 1972 argued that perception is a bottom-up process, which means that the sensory information is analyzed in one direction, that is, from simple analysis of raw sensory data to ever-increasing complexity of analysis through the visual system. Gibson attempted to give pilots training in-depth perception during the Second World War. This work also led him to the view that our perception of surfaces was more important than depth space perception. He argued that surfaces contain features sufficient to distinguish different objects from each other. Gibson also claimed that perception is direct. He worked during World War II on problems of pilot selection and testing. And then he came to realize that in his early work on aviation, he discovered what he called the optic flow patterns. When pilots approach a landing strip, the point towards which the pilot is moving appears motionless, with the rest of the visual environment apparently moving away from that point, which is actually called as the optical flow pattern. So this is an example of the optical flow pattern. Three important components of Gibson's theory are optical flow patterns, invariant features and affordances. So what are these optical flow patterns which are dependent on the light and environment? The changes in the flow of the optic array contain important information about what type of movement is taking place. For example, any flow in the optic array means that the perceiver is moving. If there is no flow, the perceiver is static. The flow of the optic array will either be coming from a particular point or moving towards one. The center of that movement indicates that the direction in which the perceiver is moving. If a flow seems to be coming out from a particular point, it means that the perceiver is moving towards that point. And if the flow seems to be moving towards that point, then the perceiver is moving away from the point. So we can look at the above image for moving towards a particular location, and the other one, the below image, is for moving away from a particular location, where you can see the arrow marks are being marked towards a particular location. So the role of invariance in perception. We rarely see a static view of an object or a scene as such. When we move our head and eyes or walk around our environment, things also move in and out of our viewing fields. Textures expand as you approach an object and contract as you move away from those objects. There is a pattern or structure available in such texture gradients which provide a source of information about the environment. This flow of texture is called as invariant. Two good examples of invariance are texture and linear perspectives, which are shown in the examples here. Texture gradient giving the appearance of, this shows the appearance of depth, where we can see the lines which are lying near to the end user are thickened, whereas the lines as they recede from the end user are shown as thin lines. Linear perspective, the parallel lines, that is example or railway tracks, appear to converge as they recede from the viewer into a particular distance. Next one is affordances. Affordances are in short termed as cues in the environment that helps or aid in perception. Important cues in the environment include optical array, which talks about the patterns of light that reach the eye from the environment, relative brightness, wherein objects with brighter or clearer image are perceived as closer images, texture gradient, the grain of texture gets smaller as the object recedes, and this gives the impression of surfaces receding into the distances. The relative size, when an object moves further away from the eye, the image gets smaller. Objects with smaller image are seen as more distant objects. Next one is superposition. If the image of one object blocks the image of another, the first object is seen as a closer object. Hide in the visual field, where objects further away are generally higher in the visual field. So these are certain examples for affordances. Evaluation of Gibbs's direct theory of perception talks about visual illusions. Gibson emphasizes on direct perception, which provides an explanation for the fast and accurate perception of the environment. However, his theory also cannot explain why perceptions are sometimes inaccurate. Examples are illusions. The illusions used in experimental work constituted are extremely artificial perceptual situations, unlikely to be encountered in the real world. The dismissal cannot realistically be applied to all illusions. So when we conclude whether it should be a bottom-up or top-down process of visual perception, neither direct nor constructivist theory of perception seem capable of explaining all perceptions at all the times. Gibson's theory appears to be based on perceivers operating under ideal viewing conditions, where the stimulus information is plentiful and is available for a suitable length of time. Constructivist theories like Grigory's, on the other hand, have typically involved viewing under less than ideal situations. Research by Tulving et al. Manipulated both the clarity of the stimulus input and the impact of the perceptual context in a world identification task. Next one is about the color visualization. So you can see various colors in the given image. What is the principle of color? The color principle laid out in the 1970s changed little since then, where there are different ways of representing colors, where RGB, HSV or HSL are different ways of representing color information. There are three primary colors which are represented as red, blue and yellow color, and there are three secondary colors which are given as purple, green and orange color. We have contrasting colors and we have complementing colors on the other hand. Artists think about gradation and mixtures that may not lie precisely along the perceptual dimensions. If we talk about tint, it is lightened desaturated hue, the other name for color, and by adding white color to the desired color information. Tone, on the other hand, is a darkened and grayed color by adding black to the given color information. Shade, on the other hand, is a mix-up of both white and black color. Here in this slide, we can see the various color mixes. Hue represents the various color information. Tint gives the color added with the white color information. Tone gives the color added with the black color information. And shade represents the color with the black and white information. Next, the color difference. Color makes the human brain to differentiate the data faster. Color also used poorly is worse, and no color at all will help in showing the differences between perception. Color can cause the wrong information to stand out and make meaningful information difficult to perceive. There are various color spaces that are available. They are also represented in the form of mathematical models which are helpful for describing color information. Some of the mathematical models for representing color are RGB, HSB, HSL, LAB and LCH. RGB, the red, green and blue, is the most common in computer use, but it is the least useful for design as such. Our eyes do not decompose the colors into various RGB constituents. HSP describes color in terms of the hue, saturation and lightness value. This is a color model based on intuitive parameters and it is more useful. Colorimetry represents the various information of the color, that is the hue which are represented around the circles, saturation inside to outside, color to grayscale, and lightness value changes from top to bottom. There are various color labels as such which are very low level perceptual information. They can be used as pop-out features and they can be useful for grouping certain elements. They are very effective when the small number of colors are used against neutral background, and they are also helpful in they are also helpful to understand the conflict with the color names, and they help in the cognitive influence. We can also represent color to quantify the information. Qualitative scale is a scale wherein colors are used to represent various qualitative values. Sequential scale is a scale wherein the color with respect to value and saturation is changed to represent the sequential value, and diverging is a crossfade through various neutral values. There are various methods useful for color selection and design. While selecting the colors, we should be very careful with respect to color harmony, and it has to be dictated by perception. Material cost needs to be considered, and the convention in which it is being represented also needs to be considered. The constraints of the color with respect to practical and functional limits should also be taken into consideration when we use colors for designing process. There are various color schemes that can be produced. So many books and series of color schemes are important for conveying the mood of content. Warm red and yellow palette are, for example, warm red and yellow palette are helpful for creating vibrant patterns. Cool blue and yellow color are helpful for creating muted patterns. Saturated will helpful in understanding youth related information. Subdued or unsaturated colors are helpful in giving sophistication and maturity kind of output. There are various color harmonious schemes as such, wherein we need to look at the monochromatic color, analogous or complementary color information, and split the complementary colors as such. Various color selection tools also exist, wherein it is possible for us to map a 1D slider onto a 2D or a 3D information, and we can have 2D chromaticity plane in the case of Photoshop. Then in the case of PowerPoint, we can see some form of HSL or HSV color palette. Accommodating viewers with anomalous vision, we need to have good contrastant values. We need to reinforce with encoding in shape and size. And accommodating the different media, we need to look at gamut mapping, and scales should be uniform and non-uniform. Usually we map a very few key colors, and we also define some robust way to move between them in a consistent fashion. There are various good and bad uses of color. The color should help us in clarifying. They should not be very confusing, and they should be very tasteful as such, should not be clumsy. The color should be robust across media, viewers and viewing condition, and they should not do any harm policy to the viewers. So as such, in the summary, we can conclude that in today's module, we have looked at what visual perception is. We have looked at the various approaches to visual perception, namely the top-down and the bottom-up approach. We have also learnt what Gregory and Gibson has talked about the various top-down and bottom-up approaches to visual perception. We have also learnt what colors are, how colors can be represented, what is a color value, and what are the various color differences. And at the last, we have also looked at the general color usage as such. Thank you.